We're going to try to wake you up a little bit here in this next talk. And to get you going there, we're going to conduct this a little bit differently, and that is to see if we can have a facilitated discussion or maybe steer you in some directions where we need help in our group with respect to moving forward. We need your help. And I know that you're a brilliant group and it's going to be difficult to steer you. You may decide that you have your own road rather than ours, but I hope we at least intrigue you with some of the questions that we're going to raise. To start you off, I'd like you to imagine that you're in an alternate universe right now, and that you're a health specialist. And you've been asked to look at the health issues in a lower-income country. And when you start looking at that country, you notice there's absolutely no health system to speak of. There's an intervention on malaria that's happening in some communities. There might be a pilot on preventing injury in another area. There could be a program on primary care somewhere else. There could be some limited policy efforts. There might be some interventions by an NGO on the common cold and what to do about it. And there's this curious study going on in Bucharest, Romania, that's looking at the particular problems of children who are being put in sanatoria because of tuberculosis. And they have to be isolated from the community in that world, and that model is unfortunately being replicated in lower-income countries around the world. So your challenge is to take all of these issues, which are very real, which are real health issues, and somehow translate that into some kind of evidence-to-action agenda that will lead to the creation of a health system in that country. And then, knowing that that health system that you're going to create is eventually going to have to deal with the issues of prevention and response to HIV, to tuberculosis, to malaria, to all the other issues you have to deal with. That's very analogous, I believe, to the kinds of issues that our group has been dealing with, and it's very analogous to the kinds of issues we're dealing with in child protection more broadly. So now I have to figure this thing out. No, it had this big screen here. It's so helpful. I can read my notes. Okay. Policy, research, and practice. These are the three areas that our group is tasked with looking at, developing gaps and recommendations. Obviously, given the gaps that were so large, we are really counting on you to help us to bridge the gap that I was just alluding to, that I was just alluding to, and that is, where do we think systemically in cross-cutting ways, and then where do we think about the kinds of silos that we were looking at in the last slides and that we were actually asked to look at the different categories of care, are those the right categories, and where's the balance between the two? We had a very short period of time to undertake this exercise, so much of what we conducted as a group was, I'd say, almost a brainstorming. We did our best. But we really need not only the green cards, but the feedback after this meeting on whether or not the balance is right, and whether or not the content of the different areas is correct. The other thing that I'd like to emphasize, and it's based on some feedback outside of this room, a little bit concerning. I was all excited about the summit, and folks started coming up to me and saying, well, in those three balloons, they're all going to go into research and nothing but. And after I started hearing that, it was actually the third time last night I got an email from a colleague, all colleagues very, very committed and devoted to the work we're doing. I thought maybe I'd want to recast these three circles and see how to make that intersection bigger or larger. Or how do we move from the separation between policy, practice, and research, bring the three balloons together, and expand that. And we have some ideas at the end, as a group, that we'd like to present to you on that for your feedback. And then there's three areas. See, I'm still looking at the screen. That we'd like you to think about with your green and blue cards down the road. And that is, what do we mean by permanent family care and its quality and duration? How do we view systems and more holistic approaches to viewing the child? And how do we link research to policy and practice? We'll get into that just a little bit briefly. We're going to start with two slides on research areas. I'd like to ask you to look at them closely because this is where we'd like your feedback on content balance. we agreed as a group to look at 6 research areas for focal group 3 to categorize the research. And the way we came up with these 6 research areas was actually intellectual property theft. And that is, there's a presentation later today by Bill Boothby that's going to outline these in more detail and more broadly. But in fact, we thought these were useful for our group, so we tried to spell it out from the perspective of the focal group areas. And those are research to determine root causes of family-child separation, research to examine the interplay between cumulative risk exposure and protective factors and outcomes for children outside of family care, longitudinal studies to assess the developmental pathways of vulnerable children outside of family care. And we heard the point on longitudinal studies being problematic yesterday. Research to advance knowledge beyond a locale to a global context. Research on sustaining effective interventions once efficacy is established, and research to take effective interventions to scale. Okay. Are those readable? Maybe dimming the lights might help because it's a little white we should anticipate. Sun. So there'll be 2 slides on this that we tried to break it down, and I'll do my best then to read them out to you and to be brief in doing so. But to highlight, I think again and again we've been hearing about the root causes. What distinguishes a system like in the former Soviet Union, where they had universal access to education and health care and generally to employment prior to 1992, and yet relied so heavily on institutional care of children from a mother in Nepal or in sub-Saharan Africa who places a child in an institution or some other kind of care because of the opportunities for education that she perceives through that choice. Many other issues and spectrums there. We need to maybe look a little bit beyond poverty, look at poverty plus, and really get at these issues of root causes, because I think we believe as a group, if we start figuring that out, we'll do much better on the kinds of policies and interventions that we'll design. The group highlighted life cycle research linking early childhood experiences and interventions to longer-term outcomes, and also a desire to look at is through paper 1, different kinds of data collection methodologies. Within risk and protective factors, the group was focusing again in terms of gaps in research on the need to look at adverse childhood experiences and child-family resilience, and the age exposure to cumulative deficits in institutions. And as far as developmental pathways, the types of research that were identified included very much highlighted yesterday the issue of older children, children after the age of 2 in institutions, the quality of care across categories of care, long-term consequences of different kinds of care, and crucially, given their numbers, which may be in the hundreds of millions, depending on whatever rough estimate we utilize, children with disabilities. I'm sorry these aren't more readable. Moving from the local to the global, the group identified applying knowledge transfer and dissemination mechanisms, and looking at the role and the effectiveness of the social workforce, both informal and formal. And in sustainability of interventions, the research priorities included emergency contexts, to systems providing prevention and care, and then linking those emergency contexts to longer-term systems building. The economics and business of institutional care, which is just one angle on why do institutions persist after 50 years of questions about their effectiveness. And then overall issues concerning how to mobilize resources and the financing and budgeting for child welfare and protection in the kinds of countries that we work in. A particular issue when you don't have the Ministry of Child Welfare and Protection, you may have ministries of health, education, justice, and others, but ones that may not be directly tasked with finance and budgeting in this area. So those are the 2 slides on gaps and recommendations, gaps and evidence needs. And on those, I should say, we'd really like to see a prioritization, folding these in together into a smaller set of some really key, well-designed pieces of research that form our work. Okay, now moving to the systemic areas. We broke this out into 4 slides for you, and each of them corresponds to the 4 systemic areas that John has outlined for you. The first concerns policy, regulation, legislation, and regulation. And the recommendations of the group centered around permanent family care. This was an idea that was highlighted at the Africa Way Forward Summit. It is one that is defined by them as an unconditional, loving, and nurturing commitment to a child by an adult or adults with parental roles or responsibilities that provide lifelong support to the child. These family relationships should have an emotional component of intimacy and a sense of belonging. It should also generally involve legal recognition of both parental and child rights and responsibilities. This is not a universally accepted definition of permanent family care. It's the one that one group of experts hammered out, and the particulars could be probably debated in another session, but I think that the essence of what we've been talking about is there. Summarized by Jack Shonkoff yesterday, is stable and supportive relationships and mutually responsive interactions with adults that lead to a healthy brain architecture and an adaptive regulatory system. So within this idea of permanent family care, the group recognizes that there are many variations. There are patrilineal families, there are matrilineal structures, there are adopted and foster families, there's different kinds of clans and extended families. There are parallel cousins, there are cross cousins, third cousins once removed, and where do they fit in different structures. I think when you get to third cousins once removed, it's about 0.1% genetic kinship at that level. And of course, issues of childhood at households and the like. So there's a strong desire by this group to recognize the diversity of family contexts in the various regions that we work in. I mean, even in New Guinea, I believe there's 832 languages with 3.9 million people, and that's about 6 or 7 languages per person in this room to learn each of those contexts. And since our slide yesterday showed that the flexibility of our brains at ages, whatever our ages are, isn't so good. I think 6 to 7 languages are going to be tough. But with all of that diversity out there, we have to understand it as best we can and engage it. Okay? Another point was made that's very important for this group, and that's quality and duration of care. And that's on the bottom, and it also focuses on the issue of care for all children. And here, I think the issue is being raised about what do you do, for example, with the children who will remain in institutions. Do you provide cost-effective interventions to improve institutional care at the risk of making those institutions more attractive for families to place their children, and also knowing that there can be cost-effective alternatives to care. And there is some evidence that has been produced showing that some changes in institutional care, even large institutional care, may produce some marginal or other benefits for the children. And one of our group members has a lot more knowledge and information on that than I may speak to it. But it's an issue that we can't ignore with millions of children in institutions, and knowing that it may take decades for institutions to become less utilized than they are today. We also, in terms of cost effectiveness of that, have to think about if an institution is already existing, it may not be that much more expensive to do an intervention with that institution in terms of training staff and the like. It could be a lot more expensive because it's small group homes or other kinds of alternatives that are out there. So these are all complicated issues, and they're all very contextual. They all really depend on what you see when you get at the country level. But the focus there on that point from the group is looking at all children. Right? Let's not deny a single child, whether they're in institutional care, or whether they're on the street, whether they're trafficked. Let's not deny them, and look at how their circumstances might be improved. And then we have specific recommendations around justice in children, strengthen policies that promote rehabilitation over retribution, and to work simultaneously on the individual, family, and community level to address structural barriers to access. I'm going to move a little quicker here in our desired discussion. And here on structures and functions, that's going to be more of the, I think, Neil's presentation and others, but the group does agree that interventions have to be cross-cutting across sectors, including health, education, social protection, justice, You need to engage a lot of actors, including our friends in the Ministries of Finance, and the social workforce, again, being emphasized as a critical area. Third area is services and interventions. A very strong desire for family-centered care through, again, reunification, kinship care, foster care, adoption, and the various issues of institutional care being less desirable, particularly for the youngest children. And institutional care to promote comprehensive evidence-based family-like interventions, small group homes. Street youth, who has identified the 5 basic elements of success, would be to frame problems and information, to collect the necessary information, help them with coping skills, social support, reducing barriers, with trafficked children, comprehensive services that are holistic, integrated, and guided by the best interests of the child, and conflict and disaster, social and cultural practices that are needed to ground our programs. And that again, I'll be somewhat brief on because of the first paper, but we again noted a variety of needs of data, enumeration of children in certain situations we'd like to highlight, periodic needs assessments and organizational assessments. We can all flesh that out a little bit later. Now, in the closing slide, we had some ideas that didn't come into the paper, but we discussed as a group, and we'd just like to present them to you now. That's a spin load. 4 things that we thought might help to work on very complicated issues in a holistic way that doesn't always divide children, but that recognizes their diversity, that looks at all the diverse cultural and country and regional contexts that we deal with, and all the systemic issues, and different income levels that countries are at, and yet somehow grasp that we can work together and not despair, that the diversity will overwhelm us. And one idea here was joint teams that go into countries from the outset that engage both practitioners, policy specialists, and researchers, with all 3 groups really putting their heads together on the right way forward to develop community-based systems that are appropriate, that are also nationally owned, and that address the spectrum of issues that really face children outside of family care and other children. There was an interest in the group of looking at demonstration countries or contexts that these joint teams could maybe look at. We can't address all the world all at once, but there might be ways that we can focus our limited resources, including the people in this room. It's a limited pool of talent, and there's some talent outside of this room, but we're thin. So we're thin. Okay, let's go back to that chart again about the brain flexibility. We need some younger folks to get involved here. But demonstration approaches were highlighted by the team. The third is using dissemination and implementation science. In fact, it's an area I need to learn a lot more about. But are there ways of taking the successes that are highlighted in demonstration interventions that seem to be systemic and that seem to be producing results that are evidence-based, and then replicating those within countries and outside the country, using dissemination and implementation science. And then finally, once again, we come back to where we started, and that is the idea of one system with multiple issues. How do we balance that to get that holistic interagency approach coordinated that builds from a lot of separate interactions to one that's just a little bit more effective and coordinated. So that's where we are. I think we have now a question and answer and dialogue piece, so thank you very much. We look forward to it.
Okay, our people will discuss a lot about how do we reduce the cost of family child separation. And one of the issues that we spent a fair amount of time talking about was just early screening possibilities for reducing possible disabilities within children, and then also early responses to disabilities, which can increase the internal toxic stress within a family, the ability of the family to cope with these issues and how to support them. Another area along that line was also examining the issues of external toxic stress, physical, environmental, and so on, and how can we identify and reduce those in order to reduce family separation. And we also talked a fair bit about research and the appropriateness of having external researchers come in, and how do we not just build on a hub model, but how do we really have the spokes in place to be able to build capacity. And the idea as well was given that, such like Susan's example, the anecdote that was really a powerful anecdote. How do we gather anecdotes and use those bases for further research?
Well, one of the things that I guess we didn't really address, that was addressed by focal question 2 in terms of the prevention issues, had to do with, you know, how do you prevent family separation? And from a systemic point of view, having a framework that allows us to do that, having a more systematic approach, is something that I think could be integrated into the systems concepts that I think we tried to present here. But it is something that you know, could be very expensive to implement. I'm not exactly sure how we go about it, and from that point of view, given the fact that you know, part of notion of moving to permanent family care has to do with the idea that we're moving resources from one aspect of the system, you know, which we tend to view as not functioning as well as it should be, to another aspect of the system. You know, providing those additional resources then for prevention seems to be a bit of a stretch, particularly without much of an evidence base. So, but I think it's just a crucial issue to try and address.
One thing our group also discussed was just the need for this analysis of what are the key issues that cause, and therefore be able to prevent family-child separation. Have to be very localized. I mean, we have to see what the situation is, and they may be very different across the country, across the region, across the world. And with that, needing to then decide and just prioritizing where are we going to get the biggest bang for the bucks, and that's.
So is the question that there's not enough evidence around what are the causes of family separation? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what are the causes, as well as, not enough evidence around what are the causes, but then the ability to prioritize. How do you choose? And, you know, where maybe screening for PKU, maybe screening for PKU in certain regions will be the most beneficial, you know, and have long-term the cost of inaction that we talked about yesterday. How much does it cost then to have somebody in an institution if the family chooses to place someone there? The cost of inaction is also
great. Other table, different tact. Go ahead.
We talked about the intractable aspects of sustainability, and we felt that what we really needed was longer periods of funding, so 5-year periods as a minimum, because it's very difficult to work when you've got, I think Susan's study has 1-year study. It's very difficult to work within that and achieve a sustainability level. The other thing that we looked at was actually training and altering perceptions to achieve sustainability. That, for example, law officers, judges, police, need training to alter mindsets around street children or around child prostitution, which I think is something that was mentioned the other day. And then we looked at the fact that someone from our table actually comes from Palestine, and she tells us that there are 15 child protection officers in Palestine who have been trained to the hilt, but they now feel disempowered by that training because they are overwhelmed by the amount of work. And so those were our discussions around sustainability.
So that's a pretty powerful example. of how you have that ongoing mentoring, right, and support for the workforce.
Just a quick point on the funding, where you started. A lot of foundations are really trying hard to think about how to extend the duration of their funding beyond the typical annual cycles or pledging for 3 years. It's difficult, but I think they're increasingly understanding that that really needs to be done. Not just thinking cross-cutting or systemically, but also thinking of the duration of funding. And the other piece of funding in some contexts is what can public budgets or government budgets put into child protection, child welfare, child well-being.
Other tables, go ahead in the back.
I'm Rebecca from UNICEF. Our ideas primarily related to practice and research. And a couple of you touched on before, so I'll just keep it short. We've got a clearinghouse for best practice resources for child protection, access both large international organisations and projects and local projects that work well. And then to that, we've got a similar website like WebMD, where someone can ask the expert, develop a cadre of experts who are qualified to answer questions, legal questions, social service questions, practical approach questions, to sort of demystify it in some way. And then a third suggestion is taking a broader sweep of existing data, literature to include US, Western Europe, and Canada, to better inform the research analysis and begin to link experts in various fields to this work. So in other words, engaging a range of experts who might not otherwise see the connection between their work and child protection, so speaking their language. And to that, we thought more strategic use of voices, alternative voices, to get the debate and conversation to a wider audience, to economists, national security advisors. And for that, we need to refine the messaging to focus on children and their welfare. As I said, maximising strategic opportunities for discussions. And that was it.
Right, the back. This clearinghouse idea keeps coming back. There's been a lot of discussions at several of the tables about the technical assistance you need to provide as part of that, not just resources. Go ahead.
Thank you. In our group, we discussed similar issues about really understanding the root causes of vulnerability. So this is across meaningful interventions across all vulnerable children. The importance of connecting and gathering research on outcomes of foster care, local adoption, international adoption, including post-placement support, outcomes for children, the cost of inaction, what characteristics of care or interventions were. And we believe that there is quite an opportunity for research in terms of regional comparison. Foster care being distributed in various countries across regions. In some countries it's working, in some others is less successful, looking at lessons and learning from regional comparison. We discussed about the importance of supporting governments to develop integrated child protection systems. But first to investigate what is their capacity to support. Usually those ministries are extremely under-resourced from human resources point of view and financially. And how difficult it is sometimes and challenging to compete with other agencies when supporting and trying to prioritize child protection development. Another interesting point and absolutely important is we believe that it's important to understand better the concepts of childhood and parenthood in different contexts. More research needing understanding the, well, let's put it the other way. We should avoid to validate simple interventions which are not actually backed by evidence, which can lead into single issues agenda and completely derail development and good interventions for children.
Reactions? John?
I think the one thing that I picked up on sort of immediately was the idea of doing comparisons, particularly in terms of outcomes data. And from the standpoint of high-income countries, there's been quite a lot of work in that area recently, and to some extent, low- and middle-income countries. It requires a certain amount of infrastructure at an international level, though, I think, in order to support effectively. And so I'm not exactly sure how that gets supported or who supports that type of work, but I think it's extremely important.
Go ahead. You first.
Okay, great. I'm going to table back there. I just wanted to bring up a few things that we discussed that weren't brought up yet.
You might want to pull that one from.
Okay. One thing that we talked a lot about was the need to recognize that family reintegration is not always possible, and to make sure that there's a risk assessment involved, that's in this determination, and that this should guide all services. So alternatives for care and family reintegration is not always possible. Another thing we talked about that was just ensuring that reintegration goes beyond just kind of placing a child in the home, follow up for 3 to 4 years afterwards, just consistent monitoring and kind of, I know we didn't talk about this, we could usually use the US or other Western literature, but just building on protocols and models that are used in the US in terms of follow-up and adapting them to specific countries and cultures. We also recognized there wasn't a lot of talk about child participation guiding the care process, so ensure that a child's voice is heard, and also ensure that that they are just they're involved in their kind of long-term plan and their voice is heard. We also talked about the need to kind of define terms such as reintegration and things like that. Our table had a lot of discussion around the need to kind of do this before we really move ahead. The other thing was focusing a little bit on seeking justice. A lot of children, if they do choose to take a shepherd or abuser to court, that they need the proper support, and that a lot of children actually find this helpful to their recovery. So, thank you.
Comments or?
These are all excellent points, and it just highlights how much there is for us to pay attention to. There's so much for us to think about in sort of 20 minutes to cover it all. On child participation, I think that's a cross-cutting issue in all the areas that will be brought up, I believe, at least in the fifth paper, so that's extremely important. I just want to highlight that we certainly appreciate that and would never forget that in terms of any interactions that we want to support.
One final quick comment. Go ahead, sir. It's you. It's yours. You're the final comment before we're on.
Most of the issues have been covered. The issue we noted in our group among the 5, one of them was literature or studies which have captured the voices of children, and we need a synthesis on this and what do they tell us before we go in for child participation, which is very, very important. So what do the children tell us? There's a lot we can hear from them, but has somebody done any synthesis? I think this is something we need to cover. The list of points have been covered, except that in terms of practice, particularly system building, there's a lot of variations. Like in low-income countries, many of the countries have been described as failed states, or fragile states, or unstable environments, where you have to do a lot of system building from time to time every 5 years. We are recommending that we need some research on this because the way you present yourself, the way you're going to work in an unstable environment, failed state, and all that, may not actually be the same as we do it. What are lessons that we learn from this and what we are some for the rest of the points we have covered? Thank you.
Any final comments?
Again, an excellent point, and this whole issue of whatever we call fragile states, weak states, emergency contexts, and the like, it's not diverse from the realm of child protection, child welfare, child well-being. And we're all trying to think this through a bit. So we've had a team in Somaliland, and there's a mapping assessment of the child protection system there that's been extremely interesting. Work in South Sudan that's ongoing, or just launching. And we have a lot of lessons to learn here. But I think that even in these very, very tenuous context. We've been in, these issues are coming up in particular ways depending on the context and being discussed perhaps a little more holistically and without always responding to an emergency, but sometimes thinking about, well, what we are doing today, how's that going to play into some kind of longer-term systems development, if that's at all possible. And that really does depend on the context and stuff.
I just wanted to, again, thank the members of our local group. A lot of time and effort and energy was put into that process. I know there's more coming, but I'm really honored to be working with such a great group of experts. So thank you.
Well, let's thank them again. Just one more set of evidence-based papers that we'll pick up after the coffee break. So